Yeah, I know what you're here for. You're here for my super secret squaring trick. Now, last video I mentioned that 41 squared is 1681. And I said I had a super secret way to figure this out. I even gave you a hint. I noted that 41 is 40 plus 1, so I could just square this sum. And I'd get 41 squared. Now, I'm guessing some of you tried this. You tried 40 squared plus 1 squared. Now let's go ahead and compute this and see what that gives us. 40 squared is 1600. And of course 1 squared is just 1. So when I add those two together, I get 1601. 1601 isn't the same as 1681, so this doesn't work. If you learn only one thing from this video, I want you to learn this. The square of the sum 40 plus 1 is not 40 squared plus 1 squared. Okay, you got it? These two are not equal. What's that? Oh yeah, that's right. I didn't tell you my super secret trick. All right, here we go. Get ready for it. You ready? Here's my super secret trick. There it is. It's a big orange square, and inside there are a bunch of little squares. There's 41 little squares in each row. There's 41 rows. So there's 41 times 41 little squares. We just count them up. All right, I didn't really count all the... Well, I did count all the little squares. I just did it in a smart way. I cut this big square into a few pieces that I could handle better, like this. I cut off a column on the end, and I cut off one row on the top. So now to count all the little squares in this, I just count those squares in each piece. I've got this one little piece up here in the corner, one little tiny square, and then I've got 40 more all the way down this column, 40 more across this top row. And then in the big square here, in the middle, well, this side, each row, has 40 little squares in it, and there are 40 of these rows. So this middle space here has 40 squared little squares. So to count all the little squares in this whole picture, which is of course 41 squared little squares, I start with the 40 squared in the middle, and that's easy to compute. 40 squared is just 1600. I add the 40 over here, the 40 extras in this column, and then the 40 and the extra 1 across the top. That's another 41. So to get to 41 squared, I start with 40 squared, 1600, I add 40, and I add 41, and I get 1681. And there's nothing particularly special about 41 or 40 here. If we know one perfect square, we can always do the same thing we just did to get to the next one. So imagine here, instead of having 41 little squares in each row, I have a plus 1. So that when I cut off one on the column, one little column here on the side, I have a left in this row, and I have a rows. And this column, this extra column over here, there's the 1 in the corner still, a more in this column, a more across the top. So this middle square here, the big piece, has a squared total little squares. So the number of little squares in the whole diagram, of course, is a plus 1 squared. But that's also got to equal the number of little squares in each of these pieces when I add them all up. The big chunk here is a squared, of course. And then I add a. And then I add a here, and I add 1 there. Add the number of squares in each piece. And again, I see that to get to the square of a plus 1, I start from a squared, and I add a, and I add a plus 1. What's that? Oh, you think I'm tricking you with my picture somehow? Very good, very good. Well, let's see if we can explain this without drawing a picture. So again, we'll start with a plus 1 squared. And of course, squaring something just means I'm multiplying it by itself. So this is a plus 1 times a plus 1. Now, how do we multiply that out? Well, it's a product here. We can use the distributive property. I'll take this times the first term, a plus 1 times a, and add it to this times the second term, a plus 1 times 1. Of course, a plus 1 times a, we use the distributive property again. We have a times a plus 1 times a. And then over here, it's just a plus 1 times 1. Well, that's just a plus 1. Anything multiplied by 1 is, you just get it back. So a times a, well, of course, that's a squared. 1 times a is a. And there we are. A plus 1, you take the square of a plus 1, you get a squared plus a plus 1. And we can also, of course, write that as a squared plus 2a. We just combine these two a's plus 1. All right, so now we know how to square a plus 1. I'm going to leave you with a little homework problem here, all right? Here's your homework problem. What is the square of a plus b? Now, we just saw that a plus 1 squared is a squared plus 2a plus 1. So we see that the square of a plus 1 is not just a squared plus 1. We've got this extra thing here, 2a. So we know right away, at least I hope we know, that the answer is not a squared plus b squared. All right, and once again, if you learn only one thing from this video, it's that the square of a sum of a and b is not the sum of the squares of a and b.